to the Minister on the basis of that last meeting. Just to set the scene for this morning, it's the first evidence session we're taking on our Laying Up inquiry. Will be a second one focused on rural areas and the left behind inland towns, and that's going to be on Wednesday the 8th of September from 4 to 5:30, probably again by Zoom. So very pleased to welcome you today to focus on the East of England's coastal communities, which, as you will all know, share some particular socio-economic characteristics and concerns which are different to the more prosperous inland cities and towns. I represent Cambridge, but even within Cambridge, you don't have to go very far to see a huge difference just in that county. And I have a long background back into the north and know well how different it is, particularly in coastal communities. And some of the areas in the east of England, of course, are much more deprived than some of the known parts of the North and the Midlands, which are frequently cited in the media. 9 places in the region, including Fenland, Peterborough, Yarmouth, Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, North Norfolk, Norwich, Harlow, Tendring and Southend-on-Sea, have been highlighted as priority 1 areas for the Community Renewal Fund by the government, and are therefore designated in need of investment. Jaywick, of course, often featured, sadly, on these lists as one of the most prime neighbourhoods in England. So some real challenges in the region. And it's not a new problem. Of course, I think members have been striding on this for many, many years, but that doesn't make it any less important that we look at new ways of trying to tackle these. And of course, with changing technologies, changing attitudes in terms of the climate crisis and emergency, we do create some real opportunities for us. It may be possible to do things differently. So got a great speaker to start us off morning. We've got Sasha Morgan, who's director of the Social Mobility Mission, who I'm delighted is going to speak to us for a few minutes. We then got some MPs from coastal communities or people with particular coastal experience. It might be useful to just bring them in quickly, and then we'll have a quick Q&As. I hope Sasha will be able to respond to. But first of all, delighted to welcome you today, Sasha. Very much look forward to what you have to say to us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chairs. Really feel quite honoured to be asked to kind of share with you. I think with the work of the Commission, which has a UK-wide remit, I guess I'll be kind of speaking to some of the topics today with regards to the region, but coming to it from probably a national perspective. So there's a kind of a balancing, but I do have a very particular place in my heart for the East of England. I received a substantive proportion of my education in Fenlands, and some of the most fun times in my life were spent with some of my favourite people in the world in places like Long Melford and parts of Suffolk, which I came to know really, really well. So I have some knowledge of the area in terms of kind of lived experience, and some of that will be in my mind as I speak. And the other thing I guess I should kind of, full disclosure, it's not hidden, but before I took on my role within the Social Mobility Commission, I was working as Chief Operating Officer at the National Infrastructure Commission. And I think one of the kind of really big reflections that I have is that when we think about the long-term transformation that we need in particular parts of our country, there often seem to be 2 parallel and not completely engaged conversations that happen. One, which is about kind of what seems to be a cluster of people stuff, which kind of gets into the space of what happens in education, how do we think about individuals, their life outcomes and where they end up. And then there seems to be a conversation that happens about places in which large infrastructure and changes and macro changes to economies are talked about separately. And I think one of the things that I feel most strongly overall is that we've got to have a more integrated way of seeing both the infrastructure and the place picture and the people in place picture if we're going to have really successful outcomes and we're going to achieve the kind of things I think we're all pulling for, which are positive changes in social mobility in this country and a conversation about how we level up. So I thought I was going to start with a bit of an overview. I'll be aware of time and we'll stop so we can have some good conversation. But social mobility at its heart is about ensuring that where you start off in life doesn't determine where you end up. It's saying that knowing who your parents are isn't essentially 100% predictor of your life outcomes. And it's reducing the balance, and it's about social circulation. It's saying that partly your choice and that you've got the chances to make determinative decisions about the outcomes you have in your life. And so it's about agency. It's about giving people control over their destinies and the ability to unleash whatever is their potential. And we've been doing a lot of reflection this year at the Commission. We produce annual reports on the status of social mobility in the United Kingdom, and we're at a critical juncture. COVID-19 is both a challenge and opportunity. The way society views social mobility, I think, about social mobility and inequality has changed. I think the pandemic has exposed inequalities and what for some people were invisible barriers in our society. And I think there's a broader public that is, and there's a growing appetite for action. And so I think there's kind of a real moment for change. After a period of crisis, I think we always get a period of opportunity because people are willing to shake up the status quo and do things differently. I think there's also something to be said about what social mobility is and it isn't. And I think the reason it's relevant when you talk about a region being the east of England or focusing at kind of the coastal communities that circle it, that this is not just about like a very small number of disadvantaged kids, getting into elite jobs. I know that's been part of the kind of historical conversation around social mobility, but it's extending the levers of power to wider groups of people. And it's about addressing these kind of geographical inequalities that we've identified actually through a long history of our work since the Commission's conception. We've done quite a lot of work on geographical inequalities, and it's a lot of that will inform some of the just observations that I want to kind of share with yourselves and with the listeners today. We think it's really, really important that people are able to find better opportunities in places where they live, rather than having to have the focus being on internal migration, which means that the most advantaged people in every place tend to move out to get on. So there's something about being able to find the right opportunities in place rather than necessarily having to shift. That is not saying that people should be prevented from moving to get opportunities. We're not stopping anyone getting on their bike, but there is something about saying, if I wish to stay rooted in community and in family and in local networks, there is a useful opportunity for me to do so. And so again, circling back to how I started, it's not just about the kind of physical and social infrastructure that surrounds people, it's about the individual outcomes within that. And it's recognizing the huge variegation. And that's one of the big things I'll be talking about today, which is that we have spaces that are very closely juxtaposed, even within the regions we're talking about, that have vastly different outcomes. And so often when we get into sorry, I think there's some noise in the background, but if we get into a situation where we kind of talk about being kind of very generalist outcomes, I think we can get very, very stuck about thinking we can do very simple things to transition from here to there. The fact is, we've got to look at highly localized interventions if we are able to level up. And I think just as a kind of a general statement of intent, and probably evidenced by the fact that I'm sitting here today, levelling up isn't just about a question of a kind of a simple north-south divide. A lot of the conversation that happens is about, a narrative that talks about the overly blessed south of the country or southeast of the country with juxtaposed between an underinvested and undersupported north. Much of that is substantially true, but the picture is much more complex about that. There is no simple north-south divide. Instead, a divide exists between London and some of its affluent commuter belt and a lot of the rest of the country. Yes, London accounts for nearly 2/3 of all social mobility hotspots. But that said, even within London boroughs, there are pockets of entrenched deprivation. And beyond this, what we also see is that there is no direct correlation between the affluence of a particular area and its ability to sustain high levels of social mobility. So whilst affluent areas tend to outperform deprived areas, actually we see lots of places that buck the trend. So I think those are kind of some really, really important things for us to take on when we first start thinking about this. And what about the East of England itself? Well, we've done, as I said, we've done a number of studies that look at geographical inequalities. We first established an index for social mobility that look at the differentiated outcomes for different local authorities in 2016, and we built on that in 2017 and 21. And what we found is that East of England, generally speaking, shows kind of about 14% of the distribution for social mobility hotspots. So actually, there are a number of parts in the East of England that are really generating high returns for people who live there and their life outcomes. We have seen that there are areas, so we include Great Yarmouth, Forest Heath, Fenland, Barber, Breckland, Cambridge as places that do significantly worse than expected given their level of deprivation. If you use the index of multiple deprivation, i.e. Given their level of deprivation, you might think that they might be performing somewhat better. So we see that in certain places, there are a number of areas in the East of England that underperform given their levels of deprivation. East of England makes up about 50% or half of the lowest 20% of areas on our 2016 index. We're rerunning it quite soon and we'll see what the new outcomes are. And we can see that, like, as you have the parts of the East of England region, and this kind of gives us this kind of distinction between different parts of East of England, the highest performing areas, which we might anticipate, are those closest to London, while the areas around Norfolk perform worst overall. So you kind of see that East Hertfordshire being the best performing area in the region at number 14, whilst Waveney is coming in at 314 out of 324 local authorities. So you're completely right. The anxiety we have about our coastal regions is justified. Those that are furthest away from London are generally getting to a kind of increasing level of difficulty in how they're able to cope and the experiences that they're able to provide for those that live there. And we see that the divide in this region is definitely affecting working lives, with essentially disproportionate amounts of people towards the London end of the kind of the eastern region, typically scoring higher jobs, high performing levels of pay. But what we see is that if we think about our most deprived neighbourhoods in England, whether it be kind of Clacton-on-Sea, etc., we see that kind of coming at the very, very most deprived where we rank it nationally. So the big kind of themes that kind of come to mind as I was thinking about what we can kind of bring to bear when we think about what we can do and what our focus should be as we think about the kind of opportunities is, one, to think about how we can focus on the interventions that work. And I think they say that oldies are goodies. Education still accounts for some of the largest impacts that we know. So one of the biggest things that we need to do is think about the quality of education interventions and what we can do most to close gaps. But what's fascinating is that education can't do all of the work, and we mustn't become over obsessed, because there are many places within the region where we see that actually the disadvantaged gaps in terms of education outcomes are much closer together, but it's the labour market outcomes, i.e. what salaries people are able to achieve, where you see these massive distinctions. So you get the sense in which, for example, when we did work just last year, you have, when we looked at all young people, in this case, actually, no, it was mainly boys who were on free school meals, what we could see is that if you kind of came from Dacorum or North Hertfordshire or South Cambridgeshire, you could be earning up to £5,000 to £6,000 more per annum than a young disadvantaged man from the same background who is growing up in Fenland. And that kind of massive shift within relatively few amount of miles tells us that it's not only education that we have to be focused on. We really need to be thinking about labour market outcomes. We need to be thinking about those transitions that happen outside of the school system. And we need to think about how the coalitions of institutions, including higher and further education institutions, local employers, and local institutions that push forward skills can work better together. from our perspective, we think that employers are a massive, massive part of how we can think about the future of our coastal communities, and thinking about how they can open up where it is that they site their headquarters, how they think about their their recruitment, how they think about who they value and who they bring into their institutions. And particularly, we also think it's important to recognise that national level kind of interventions or thoughts about these things are really important. So we kind of believe that if we look at these coastal communities, low pay is an endemic problem. We know that about 1 in 6 people across the country can escape low pay, but for example, nearly half the residents in St Albans are in managerial and professional jobs, but a quarter do not even earn the voluntary living wage. In North Norfolk, Forest Heath, Norwich, the majority of residents are earning a lower than average wage. And as few as 1 in 5 people in a top job in some of these areas are up to as many as 4 in 10 are earning below the living wage. And so I kind of think that one of the things we need to do is have that conversation with employers about what we can do to improve low pay, what we can do within these organisations to build a culture of better progression, how we can make sure that people in these communities are getting the skills that they need to move on and up and earn more and bring more home for their families. And we need to think about how we can target apprenticeship opportunities in a way that really reaps return for the disadvantaged and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Apprenticeships are brilliant. I think the government is to be commended for trying to get equivalence between academic and technical routes, but we need to make sure that there is a fair distribution of this amazing opportunity for those who are furthest away from the labour market and don't get those opportunities. And we're pretty supportive, I think, if I kind of start to wrap up this section, of some of the things that the Levelling Up Task Force so far has called for. And so we think that there's a sense of thinking about the balance between both what we can do as local and place-based interventions and what needs to happen at a more significant level. So we need to think about poverty. We know that there's a massive link between poverty, and particularly child poverty, and later social mobility outcomes in life. So there's a question about where our welfare system is, so that those in those coastal communities who are really struggling, who want to be supporting their families and want to provide the best opportunities, can do that. We can do a certain amount within education, but there's a difficulty of managing out everything about the poverty impacts through the school system. From our perspective, some of that's got to be done within the families and before those children even get to school, where we know the disadvantage gap opens up super early. So where are we with supporting the government to think through where we need to be on welfare and benefits, and what changes to those national systems are going to have incredibly important local outcomes? And we need to kind of think just as a whole, how does Treasury, how do our tax and spending decisions help us level up? How can we make sure that we have geographical analysis of budgets and fiscal events, and we make sure that we understand the differential impacts that tax and spending changes happen over different kinds of areas? So it's saying, yes, we think that place-based interventions can be really helpful. I'm sure there'll be discussions about different ones that are around at the moment. I can't promise to give the best critique and analysis of all of those interventions, but we think there's a place for them. But we think they need to happen alongside infrastructure investment, and we think they need to happen alongside national decisions about welfare and benefits that mean that the most fragile families in some of our most disadvantaged areas have enough support that they can do what they want to move on to in life. So I hope that's been a helpful kind of starter for 10, and just really interested in having questions and discussion.
It really is. Thank you so much, Sasha. That's really, really helpful and a good start. Now, usual kind of rules apply. Raise your blue hand if you can. Peter has instantly raised his blue hand, which is very obedient of him. I'll bring him in almost immediately. While Peter is speaking, if any of you others have got either contributions or questions, I'm particularly looking to colleagues, perhaps councillors from coastal communities who may have something specific either to say or to ask Sasha. I've got questions too, but let me go to Peter first. Peter.
Daniel, very many thanks, and Sasha, a special thanks for setting the scene so well. I represent Waveney, which predominantly includes the coastal town of Lowestoft, which does have deep pockets of deprivation, as you highlighted. I think if you look round the East Anglian coast, there are, those pockets of deprivation are very often hidden. There are areas of great wealth around our coast, whether that is Lancaster, Burnham Market, Southwold, Aldborough, but that tends perhaps to mask and drown out where we have real challenges, whether that's in Lynn, Yarmouth, Lowestoft, or in Clacton and Jaywick. And so probably these issues do not get the attention that they need. When I look at Lowestoft, which very much I think used to be, I would describe the very model of a model coastal town, in that we had a thriving fishing industry, we had a wide network of factories, a canning factory, a television factory, a coachworks. That's all gone. And I think a lot of that is down to the decline of British industry over the last 40 or 50 years, not able to compete on a global scale. You've got the rise of the package holiday as well. A lot of, someone like Yarmouth was the Blackpool of the East. It was where we all went for our holidays. But over the last 30 or 40 years, that trend has changed. Perhaps coming out of the pandemic, there might be a move back towards staycations. Certainly when I look in my area, the feedback I'm getting from caravan parks, they've got potential investors beating a path to their door, wanting to buy into that particular market. I think one of the reasons behind the decline was the poor communications. And when we moved from, you moved in large scales, we used to do it by the railways, and then post-war, we we all got into our cars. When we had railways, all of these coastal towns had railway stations, and the one in Lowestoft went right into the fish market. But when we replaced that with the roads, the equivalent, the dual carriageway roads, didn't extend out to our coastal towns. If we look in Suffolk, they probably stopped at Ipswich. Look in Norfolk, I could say they stopped at Norwich, but actually up until about 30 years ago, there wasn't any dual carriageways in Norfolk at all. So I think that has been a major decline and a major reason. And I think moving forward, when we look at the next means of communication, that is broadband, and we've had this APPG's had separate discussions on that. We must make sure that our area is not left behind when it comes to broadband. So actually, you quite rightly identified the challenges with education. It's difficult to get, recruit high quality teachers to move out to coastal communities. I think because you're on the edge, there's a concern. And if you're working and teaching in the Midlands, you can move around from one job to the next quite easily. There's perhaps a reluctance to make that commitment out to the coast. That said, I think our education system is very, very gradually improving. Where I go from here is to talk about early years settings, where I think we've still got to do a lot more work. Now, against that, being plus, I think we do have great opportunities. I think the marine environment and the work we do there, and the interest generally around on the marine environment, that provides opportunities, as does the energy sector and the move towards renewables, and also perhaps return and promoting our tourism opportunities. I think I'll just quickly highlight on the various initiatives government are putting out. I'm not sure that there is a worry, certainly from a Suffolk perspective, that the Levelling Up Fund, Community Renewal Fund, perhaps are not focusing on the challenges we've got. The measures of deprivation tend to be based on they're looking at a district level, and that doesn't bore down to where, as I said, when I came in, we've got these hidden pockets of deprivation. But I've sensed, I see Ivan wants to have a word here. I think I've sort of set the scene from my perspective. And Daniel, I'll hand over for others to have their say. Thank you.
Very good, thank you, Peter. Very, very good to bring Councillor Ivan Henderson, who's from Essex County Council and represents some of those coastal communities. Ivan.
Thanks, Daniel. And apologies, I missed some of your presentation, Sasha. I lost connection, but I did manage to get some of it, and I found it really interesting and actually music to my ears. Some of the stuff you were talking about, because you talked about entrenched deprivation and poverty from over the years, and as Daniel said, I'm an Essex County Councillor, I'm a Tendron District Councillor. I was the MP for the coastal areas around here for 8 years, and trying to deal with some of those poverty issues and pockets of poverty around both my area, Harwich, and the Clacton and Jaywick area. And I think the problem is, and it's not just this government, I think it's previous governments as well, is they come out with these initiatives, and absolutely right what was just said about, I'm not sure if the Levelling Up funding is still the right funding, which is going to deal with those really serious issues. I remember years talking within the last Labour government when they were coming out with things like new deals for communities. We never ever come out with a initiative which actually drills down into those issues that we really need to deal with, which is areas of severe deprivation and poverty, such as the ones I said. The only initiative I can remember in those years, which did touch on it slightly, was when we brought in a thing called Market Towns initiatives, and it did actually pinpoint. And I give you an example of my area in Harwich, and I like the comments you made, Sasha, about we need to be more localised. I've already seen the signs I've seen from the Levelling Up, where we're talking about £20 million going into Clacton town centre. I'm not sure what that's going to deliver for those areas of deprivation and those pockets of poverty and those high levels of child poverty which we're dealing with at the moment. By the way, which was there prior to the pandemic. I think the pandemic's just shone a massive light and highlighted all the issues that you're talking about, whether it be benefit, some of the benefit changes and stuff, which has put these families in a dreadful position. But if I give you an example of the Market Towns initiative, which came about in Harwich, it formulated a thing called Harwich Connections, which was a community transport cooperative. But then they went into early years, like nursery. They took on the Ark Nursery, Noah's Ark Nursery in Harwich, and then they took on some small industrial units. So they built themselves around just from that one thing. They've built something within a localised community which can offer that localised community some benefits. And we're now taking advantage of that connections, where we're having this summer hunger holidays where some families can't reach and access those services where they're being run. And we're using connections actually to bring those families and children to those areas. So they're the sort of things I think can have a change, rather than these big, glossy, massive amounts of money which go into an area and may sound good, may look good on a sunshine coast, but does nothing to deal with the hidden levels of deprivation which have existed for far too long. And one of the biggest issues, and you say education, but I think one of the stumbling blocks for some of the families that I deal with, it is education, but it's where they live as well, and the house they live in, the conditions they live in, where there's no provision for them to do their homework, they're damp, the housing's damp, it's not good enough, and it doesn't inspire them to actually make something and lift their lives out of that poverty and deprivation they're in. So I mean, that's a quick snapshot, but I think I like your idea of early intervention. I like your idea of localised, more localised targeting, and I also like your idea of what you said about it's not just about infrastructure, It's about joining that infrastructure up to see what that actually delivers for some of these communities which have been left behind. And they're we always tend, even when there was an East of England Development Agency, we've now got local enterprise partnerships. We go for the easy fixes and the nice sound bites. We never go for the very difficult, challenging things that we need to do to actually turn these people's lives around. Thanks, Daniel. At least that's given me a chance to get that off my chest, which has been bugging me, and it will bug me forever until we start dealing with it.
Thanks, Ivan. No, that's really, really helpful. We've also got some sensible things said in the chat. If anyone who's putting stuff in chat would like to speak to them as well, that'd be really helpful. I've got a couple of questions perhaps to put to you, Sasha, before bring back in, perhaps to respond both to Peter and to Ivan. I'm the Shadow Rural Affairs Minister, so I find myself having perhaps conversations with people around the country. It's not unique to the East of England. And a couple of things like me, are there other places, possibly not even in the UK, that are dealing with these issues and find ways to succeed? Because I think, as Ivan has hinted, this isn't really necessarily a party political issue, although I think there probably are some politics in it as well. But governments consistently try and do stuff, and with varying degrees of success. The very fact that we're still talking about it 20, 30 years on in some cases shows that there are a whole range of initiatives that are tried, varying degrees. Are there other places and good examples of what could be done in communities? And following on a bit from Ivan's point, really, the fractured governance relationships, and it's partly the reason we had this all-party group, because regional policy did get a bit fractured without thinking about it after 2010. The current government is kind of putting some of it back together again, but I'm still not convinced we actually have regional governance. And of course, within the East of England, we have some very different models. In my county, in Cambridge, we have a metro mayor, which is slightly odd because maybe they're metro mayors in urban areas, but that's a rural example. And of course, we have two-tier local government with all the challenging issues that poses as well. So, and then that question of the business community fits in. We've been through business, local enterprise partnerships, now combined authorities. Again, is there anything that we can learn from some of these models and make perhaps suggestions back to government based on that experience? It's quite a lot of questions, sorry. I'm looking to you, Sasha. Sorry, are you trying to mute? Very good.
Look at all of those skills, and I think if we think about my poor digital skills in trying to get us unmuted, I can think it takes us to kind of one of the big points that Ivan was making, and I'll try and pick up points as much as I can across the point, so across the piece. So one, the Commission is kind of completely wholly with, I mean, so many things that Ivan said has so much great resonance, so I'll try and pick up just a few of them. One, digital divide, massive, pre-existing, but really exposed. When we think about the transition to, for example, home learning and what we've seen around learning loss, it wasn't just what teachers needed to do to think about the shifts and improvement to pedagogy. But it's about the spaces in which children had to learn and the capacity, but it was also about broadband strength, and it was about the access to the right devices. And so bridging the digital divide is just going to be such a important part if we're going to think about improved social mobility. When the pandemic hit, only 51% of households earning between 6,000 and 10,000 had home internet access. Literally, that's pretty much half of all of those people had no home internet access. So how was learning going to happen, even if you could get a device there, even if the teaching was really high quality and they were able to get through? That is a shocking figure, and all of you will be able to think about how that plays out into people in your local constituencies. It's 99% of households with an income over 40,000% have internet access. So there is a stark income related access. So we have to start thinking about broadband and digital access as being about kind of core provision, recognizing, as I do, that it's something that is very well delivered in many, many places by the market. But we have to think, and I know government is thinking about it, but we need to do better and faster on looking at the gap where the market case doesn't work as efficiently and where it is non-economical for private actors to make the provision of enough enough good connectivity and, in many cases full fibre in parts of areas which, particularly within the areas you're talking about, which are coastal and have like lots of rurality, how do you make that work? So affordable access to devices and networks, and ensuring that not only then do you have then the kind of connectivity, but that everyone has the essential digital skills is a massive part of what we need to do. Ivan, I really also heard something about consistency. Because I think, there's a challenge, right, between the kind of political reality of the timeframes that MPs who are fighting hard for their local constituencies have to work within, and the scale of the challenge, i.e., just like infrastructure, changing things on social mobility takes generations. It takes a lengthy period of time. And it's one of the reasons we've got to come to cross-governmental, cross-party consensus on the things and the chunks of things we think we can make consistent long-term progress on, because these are chronic, not just acute problems. They're not problems that have just turned up over the last year. And there's a nature of having to work on them consistently. And there's a problem if the interventions shift every time somebody feels that they need to have a new branding issue, which is why I tend to try not to give scathing critiques of any particular place-based programme, although the Commission in some cases have observations about how they can be improved, but really focus, how can we build on whatever is the last thing that has been done to make that kind of incremental, slow, but progress that makes sense in place. Because I think there is a big challenge of saying, you want to do something nationally and you have a big title of something that's called levelling up, but it is very, very specific. And I think that's where you have to question the level of what can be kind of designed and thought up in Westminster, and the areas where it's actually groups of local actors that have to work together to identify the specific kinds of combinations of interventions that are going to work. We just recently did a study looking at the schools across the country that are making consistent progress on closing the gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged kids. And the fact is, there were so few schools that are making consistent progress over 3 years. And we found no consistency between type of school. We saw no consistency between, in many cases, some of the interventions that they were using. But what we did see was that we needed to have better conversations between schools that had very similar combinations of characteristics, i.e. typologies of places. And when I was reading and thinking about talking to you all today and having this conversation, I talk as someone who lives in a coastal community, albeit not in the east of England, but I live in Thanet, which has a lot of kind of localized deprivation. And I think one of the things I reflected on was making sure that we recognize when we're special and when there is something about where we are that is really different, but the extent to which some of the issues that you're seeing in communities like Harwich, in places like Jowett, in Great Yarmouth, continuing the kind of common cause with other coastal areas and keeping pushing the fact that I definitely would agree. I think it happened right at the beginning of this conversation, but we need to do more to think about this particular typology of place and what the particular opportunities are. So I have seen in my local town of Margate and places like Broadstairs and Ramsgate what the shifts have been because of staycations. But is this a long-lasting change, and can we bet on new opportunities to do with local tourism? Potentially so. Potentially we have seen a behavioural shift, and what can we do to help people take the best advantage of that in our coastal communities? I've seen places, I'm talking very much from personal experience, but places like Folkestone doing things around cultural regeneration in towns that used to be kind of these magical sunspots, what is the full extent of that kind of cultural regeneration, and where does it need to be matched with very different kinds of investment, i.e. The investment of significant companies that find benefits in taking their organizations and into places where you can see the sea and you can smell the sea air and you can get all of the great benefits that people in the Victorian era came when they came with their bathing machines and wanted to come because they wanted to escape the smog of London. How can we make that really, really specific? I heard other things when I was kind of, I guess, listening to Ivan as well. And it was around early years. And for the Commission, I think we're in real agreement that this is an area in which we have to get right and have to do well. And our view is that that's around national interventions, particularly around the stability of the early years workforce. The early years workforce is some of our most underpaid and yet tasked with caring for some of our most precious human assets, our youngest children. And that group of people is underpaid, and with the number of the amount of nursery provision that's happening in the private sector, we have to think about the stability of those institutions, not just as small businesses, but as critical parts of our human infrastructure. And how do we invest in those, and how do we keep them strong? We think there are really interesting things that are happening with family hubs, but there is just something about scale and getting them up and running so that we can learn about the best of multi-agency cross-working in supporting families get the very best starts for their children. So very supportive and completely concur on the fact that we need to be better at closing the digital divide. Really, really agree with the importance of early years and early years settings. I took the point about recruitment and retention. We recently, the report that I was drawing on before, which talked about progress 8 against the odds, made the point that we really need to think about different forms of incentives, not just money, but recognition and support and networks for schools that are enabling them to make progress in the most disadvantaged places. And we need to be smarter about it, because there is no silver bullet. None of the evidence that I have seen suggests there is a one-size-fits-all way of making progress. And then I guess I would leave with that kind of comment about the balance of what can be done centrally and how central initiatives can be made more locally sensitive, but something else in thinking about how we spend more and longer periods of time focusing on place-based interventions, but not giving up on them after 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, recognizing these are 30-year investments that we should be making in particular localities, because we didn't get here overnight. We didn't, our communities didn't become the way they are in 1 year or 2 years. So we cannot expect and judge ourselves by those metrics. And it's one of the reasons why the Commission is trying to encourage government to put in place new metrics for thinking about how it measures, that gets beyond kind of 1 and 3 years, but takes you into 5, 10 and 30-year measures. So you can have a sense across using national benchmarks about how local places are working. And that's not trying to kind of iron everything out across the country, but it is to say, how can we make the horizon of change slightly further and get behind the consistency of investment that we're going to need to make the changes that we want.
Great, that's really, really helpful, Sasha. Thank you so much. Thank you for your brilliant contribution this morning. Apologies to Councillor Richard Roberts. I failed to see your hand go early enough. Hopefully your contribution can be made in the second half. Sasha, I say thanks ever so much again. I'm now going to hand back to Peter as we go on to the next set of speakers. Peter.
Daniel, very many thanks for that, and special thanks to Sasha as well for starting off this inquiry so well for us. The next part of the briefing is we're going to be looking at the critical role of fishing, ports and tourism. I'm chairing this event, though I will have to leave just before 11:25 to go and ask a question in the chamber. So Daniel will resume at that stage, but we've got 3 speakers, and without further ado, I'll introduce the first of those, Paul Davey, who's Head of Corporate Affairs at Hutchison Ports. Now, Paul is with us until 11 o'clock when he has to go to a Free Ports meeting at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. But I'll bring in Paul straight away to set out the scene from his perspective. And can I suggest that we then just pause, and if there are any questions for Paul at that stage, we take them at that time before we hear from Rodney and Pete. So Paul, it's good to see you with that appropriate backdrop. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to the APPG for inviting me to address this inquiry. I should just say that MHCLG have kindly given me 15 more minutes. So I am with you till 11:15, which just gives us a few more minutes if there are any questions. I can't really speak for all the ports in the east of England, but the region has some of the most important ports in the country, including Felixstowe and Harwich, operated by Hutchison Ports, and on whose behalf I can certainly speak. Although all ports fulfill broadly the same basic role, they all transfer goods or people from land to sea. Each port is very different, and each is a function of its local geography, its local resource, its labour force, and its connectivity. However, I think one thing that almost all ports have in common is that they're rarely located in the most sought-after parts of town. Many are set in or near areas of relative or even absolute deprivation. And that includes most of those in the east of England, including, I think, the ones that we operate. Although there are some lovely places in the east of England and some very lovely places very close by to where we are in a diverse area, and there are pockets of significant income and employment deprivation. We've already heard a little bit about sort of tendering in areas, but 18% of the neighbourhoods in tendering, and indeed 14% in Ipswich, which is from where we draw about half of our employees, were ranked among the top 10% most deprived in England and in 2019. And 4 areas in tendering were ranked amongst the top 1% of deprived areas. And as we've heard, and as we all know, Jaywick, of course, is ranked as the single most deprived neighbourhood in the country. So we have GDP per capita across the Suffolk and Essex Haven Gateway area. And we call the sort of Haven Gateway area really the area around sort of Felixstowe, Ipswich, Harwich, that harbour, Harwich Harbour area referred to as the Haven Gateway. GDP there trails both the East of England region and the whole of England. GDP in the Essex Haven Gateway area is about £25,800 per head, as compared to 31,980 nationally. So that's about 20% lower than the national average, and it puts tendering about 140 of that of 179 local areas in the country. In this area as well, the economic inactivity, skills deficiencies, and suppressed household incomes are concentrated in and around sort of Clacton and Jaywick, as we've heard about, the southern part of Felixstowe where the port is located, also, and again, as Ivan's mentioned, parts of Harwich and Ipswich. Wage growth has also been particularly weak in these areas. ONS data shows that the average weekly earnings in tendering, for example, are £556, and in Ipswich, £527. Both of those are below the UK GB average of £587, and perhaps even more surprisingly, they're actually below averages in locations such as Liverpool and Leeds as well, which are sort of where the perception certainly is much more widely held that they're the deprived areas, not those in this region. I must admit, I'm sort of familiar with these statistics. I've got to be honest, I have to confess, I didn't look them up, especially for this session. I had them to hand because it was important. We had to collate them as part of the Freeport bid that we made recently. And as members of this committee will know, the government has recently announced 8 new freeports in England. And one of those, Freeport East, is going to be centred around the ports of Felixstowe and Harwich. Freeports are a flagship government programme, their words, not mine, and that will play an important part in the UK's post-COVID economic recovery. The government's aiming to achieve 3 core objectives through freeports. Firstly, they want to establish freeports as national hubs for global trade and investment. Secondly, they want to create hotbeds for innovation. And thirdly, they want to promote regeneration and job creation. And it's that last objective, which is the lead policy objective for government. Government clearly wants freeports to contribute to realising the levelling up agenda, bringing jobs, investments and prosperity to some of the most deprived parts and communities within the country. So Freeport East, we've established, I say we, I'm going to use the word we quite a lot. Sometimes I mean we Hutchison, sometimes I mean we Freeport East, and sometimes they're going to be a rather more collective we as we the east of England. So I'll try and be a little bit specific as to which we I'm talking about on each time. But in this occasion, we, which may be Hutchison Ports, but it's also our partners. We came together with the two LEPs, obviously Suffolk and Essex, Felixstowe and Harwich, straddle not only the county border, but also the local enterprise partnership border here. So we've got two LEPs involved, we've got two county councils involved, we've got 3 or 4 district councils involved, and we've got other partners such as the Haven Gateway Partnership, Harwich Haven Authority, have all come together and all came together really to put the bid together and then to submit it to government. And that bidding process was a competitive one. And we and I know our partners were very grateful for the support of many of the members of the APPG in that process. As we heard, and I think Sasha mentioned as well, low incomes are widespread and entrenched across many of our communities. And the Freeports are designed, and our Freeports are designed specifically to create new economic opportunities to really address those challenges head on. And I think, we have in this area, we have a great opportunity to do that. Felixstowe is already the biggest container port in the country. Harwich is one of the main ferry ports and has established connections to the offshore wind industry. And our Freeport's really going to focus on 2 main areas of opportunity linked to the existing strengths we have. So firstly, we're hoping to attract businesses that will want to sort of capitalize on the benefits of a UK location. And we know the UK is still very attractive for international businesses, and particularly for us, businesses that are bringing in goods or components from around the world, making the best of the connections we already have here, and then manufacturing or processing or kitting out those goods before they distribute around the UK or crucially back towards Europe, and using the UK as a sort of a springboard into Europe, as well as benefiting from the tax incentives on offering a free port. Our free port will enable them to do that and avoid paying the sort of double duty that they would do now, bringing goods into the UK and then shipping them to Europe. Since we left the EU, that would involve sort of a double duty hit, if you like, which can be avoided by the free port. So there's some real advantages for them in that area. The second area where we're going to be focusing is really building on Harwich's involvement so far in the offshore wind sector, and the fact that about 50% of all consented offshore wind farm activity is in the southern North Sea, really right on our doorstep here. And I think that gives us the opportunity at Harwich to create a sort of a green energy hub, which will contribute in a variety of ways to the Prime Minister's sort of 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and gives opportunities, I say, primarily in Harwich for both manufacturing and operational maintenance centres around those offshore wind farms. We're also working with EDF Energy and Rise Hydrogen, who are linked to the JCB group, on plans to create a hydrogen hub in the Freeport as well. So there'll be a range of job and career opportunities that go beyond really the normal port offering, we think. It's still slightly early days in the Freeport development. No Freeports, and our Freeport obviously included, won't be formally designated until later in the year, but we're already in discussion with various partners in the further and higher education sectors about how Freeports, can help act as a catalyst for local skills and training. And we, and this is a Freeport we, not a Hutchison we, will be appointing an FE or an HE representative to the Freeport board in the next sort of few weeks or months, but over the next few weeks, just to ensure that that sort of skills and training element is really embedded as part of its core activities. There are further discussions to be had with government about the levers and the resources that free ports will have and may need to deliver some of the benefits to the deprived communities we have locally. And indeed, the meeting I have to go to very shortly with MHCLG is touching on some of those issues. But I think there's no doubt that the Freeport initiatives and Freeport East in our region offers one of the best opportunities that we have. And I say this time, I mean we as in a collective, we, all of us here, but it's one of the best opportunities that we have had for a very long time to address some of these local issues of deprivation on that. I agree entirely with what Sasha said, that a lot of this starts early. It's about education, it's about engagement with both schools and colleges. The Freeport itself is it touches along lots of government departments. You know, we're already working with MHCLG, but Treasury are involved, Department for Transport is involved, Department for International Trade are already involved. On the skills agenda, maybe the DFE, maybe Department for Works and Pensions need to be involved as well. You know, it's not clear yet, but I think, you know, one of the things that we do need is a clear mechanism, I guess, for dealing across government and ensuring that government also deals across the various departments in the most effective way possible, so that we don't let this sort of Freeport opportunity slip through our fingers, and that we make the most of it to address some of those levelling up issues we have in our coastal and indeed our port communities. I think that's all I had to say. So thank you for that opportunity, and I'm quite happy to take any questions on that.
Well, that's many thanks for outlining the exciting opportunity for the region. You're kindly with us to about 11:15, but just so we don't have a mad rush at the end there, any observations or any questions for Paul at this stage from anyone? Anyone put up your virtual hand or put something in the chat box? And Daniel's put his hand up. Daniel. Yeah,
very question. We hear a lot about labour shortages at the moment across a whole range of industries for a variety of reasons, including Brexit. Is that something that's affecting you? But perhaps more specifically, does that create opportunities for people who wouldn't have been part of that workforce before?
So then my audio did a sort of a hesitation as you started your question. What was the impact? Could you just repeat the start of it? So.
Sorry, I think it may have been mine. Basically, are you seeing changes in the labour force, particularly post-Brexit? Is that creating opportunities potentially for others?
Yes, I guess it is in a sense. We're not affected directly ourselves. We've got adequate access to labour, but I must admit, there are increasing signs now of shortages in HGV drivers. I'm hearing now also some of the sort of distribution centres and warehouse operatives would have again been fairly heavily reliant on East European labour. There are shortages appearing then. At the moment, I would say we are just about managing. Again, we in this case being the industry and the haulage sector particularly. There are shortages in other parts of the haulage industry. I think regionally as well, there's some variation there. It's coming higher up the agenda in the conversations with Department for Transport, but there's not an immediate solution, I don't think, on that one. Yeah, we have a lot of rail connections out of Felixstowe. Some of our rail customers are looking at expanding that, you know, partly in response to haulier shortages, but of course the rail is sort of constrained as well by infrastructure. You know, Network Rail are looking to upgrade the line at Ely, particularly Ely Junction is a bottleneck, which I think probably most people on this call have heard of, and again we're very grateful for the support that everyone is given to sort of keep the pressure on Department for Transport and Network Rail to improve Ely. So yeah, there are some issues on the horizon, but I think we're for the ports anyway, they're not impinging on us at the moment.
Many thanks, Paul. And now Councillor Richard Robertson. Richard.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I'll pick up on the point that Paul's made about hydrogen. I think our region has an important role in the development of hydrogen for the country, and not just for our region. And I know there are various developments going ahead right now. The Sizewell people are building a facility as a pilot example, as well as the ones you mentioned in the ports. I think it's fairly clear to me that hydrogen may very well be very important for shipping and for HGVs and railways, because so much of our region is not electrified, but replacing diesel engines with hydrogen fueled engines would be a major advantage without having to put all the electrification in and decarbonising it at the same time. HGVs, I believe that it seems to me that unless there's an amazing development in battery development, that hydrogen is a better option. It'll be faster to refuel and lighter to carry, and I think there's really good potential. So I'm hoping we'll be able to expand on that. The Hydrogen East people are very well advanced on this, and I've been following what they've been up to. I'm a Cambridge councillor, by the way, and I'll just touch on the points I was going to make in the first half, if I may. Cambridge has for a very long time had a vast amount of commuting going on, most of it down to London, yes, but we've also had people commuting into Cambridge from all over the region. North Norfolk, believe it or not, people were commuting into Cambridge from North Norfolk by car, and causing us problems in Cambridge, as well as having all the hassle of all the travel. And I think that our opportunity that our appalling lockdown has given us is to develop more working at home, working in rural areas and in coastal areas. I think it's extremely important that we make sure that the broadband infrastructure is enhanced greatly where it's very slow. I know that's not the case in all the ports, but nevertheless in some areas it's pretty awful, I'm told. And getting some sort of competition to keep the costs down. Make sure there is competition for that broadband, not just one supplier. It's essential if we're going to keep the costs down for people to be able to use it effectively. One final point: children may have access to the broadband at home, but often it's only a phone. It's essential that they have something like a tablet at the very least to work from at home. If the broadband is there and you're trying to use a phone to make the best of it, it's not adequate really, as anybody who's tried to use the phone very much for research will tell you. It's a tablet or a laptop that's required. So investment in secondary school provision, particularly of tablets, is something we really should be pushing for. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Very many thanks for that, and for giving that overview, in particular the point on hydrogen. Paul, is there anything you would just like to add on that specific issue?
Yeah, I think just very briefly on hydrogen, certainly the partners that we're dealing with is I think the next challenge in the sense that we face, and again, a royal we here, we expected the government's hydrogen strategy sort of in the summer. Most of the focus of the hydrogen strategy so far has been on the production of hydrogen. I think what we would like to see is a sort of an extension of that focus to include some of the use cases. Yeah, we have about 5,000 trucks every day in and out of the ports here. We have 72 train movements, lots of maritime movements. And with these sort of immature, if you like, technologies, new technologies, having scale is really important in rolling them out to try and grasp the economies of scale that are available. So we think, that our Freeport offers a real opportunity there, but there will probably be a little work to do and a little work with government to do. At the moment, for example, green hydrogen, which is what everyone wants to use, is about sort of £6 per kilo, whereas grey hydrogen, which is created by fossil fuels, is something like £1.50 a kilo, I think. So it's getting over some of those economic hurdles that exist, so that the economic model for hydrogen can become sustainable as well as the environmental model for hydrogen.
Many thanks for that, Paul. I see Ivan's got his hand up, but Ivan, can I just ask you to hold that, because if we can just get in our two next presentations. The next presentation is from Rodney Anderson, who is Special Advisor to the Renaissance of East Anglian Fisheries Steering Group, which is hosted by East Suffolk Council, and I do chair it. But Rodney, the stage is over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for this opportunity. The first thing to say, actually, I was very struck by everything that Sasha had to say, and her points really go to the heart of fisheries policy, and the questions need to be asked about, well, why are we investing in fishing? Why do we actually care about the fishing industry? Why does it matter? And if you look at it nationally in terms of the UK's GVA, it's very small. I think the leather industries are probably about on par. And it might be said, well, it probably doesn't matter that much in GVA terms. But fishing is, by its very nature, it's coastal and it's highly localized. And because of that, changes in the industry's forecasts, what happens to that industry can be very noticeable locally and have very substantial impact. It's often lumped in by commentators with other UK industries that rely upon raw resources, especially those that have been associated with lack of profitability and decline. Industries like in textiles, coal, ceramics, and more recently steel. But fishing is different. It's very different from these other industries for a number of reasons. First of all, the resource is renewable. If well managed, fish stocks offer a permanent harvest capable of substantial growth. There is strong demand globally for the product, which outstrips supply, and aquaculture is increasingly filling that gap. And unlike some other industries, the UK wild capture industry is not competing with low-cost competition from elsewhere in the world. It mainly competes with developed countries. In the case of the UK, Scandinavia, Iceland, and other actually high-cost, low-subsidy countries. If we look at it from the point of view of wealth generation, fish stocks are capable of generating substantial returns perennially for modest investment. It's an industry that provides jobs in areas where jobs that can be hard to find, where young people are, as we've heard, moving away to find employment, and where a growth industry would make a real difference. Another characteristic of the industry, particularly the catching sector, it's a great leveler. If you're joining from following a higher education, successful higher education career, or you're coming straight out of school with few qualifications, the basic skills and knowledge that you require to gain are exactly the same. So you can come in at any entry point, and if you're good at what you do, you can be successful. The UK is actually a fishing nation. We still have the second largest fleet in Europe. It's part of the identity of many coastal towns and villages. The businesses are rooted in the community. They're part of the community. They belong, and there can be a pride in belonging to be part of this. And then, of course, a fishing harbour, a busy fishing harbour, is always of interest. It's a place to visit, and it became part of the visitor attraction. Fish is a healthy source of nutrition. It's not only enjoyable to eat, it's actually good for you. So let's turn please to the next slide, which is about resources. The UK is fortunate in having resource-rich seas. They're among the, in terms of the fish populations, the richest seas in Europe. And we have a long tradition because of that, of fishing as a way of life among our coastal communities. Now, if you watch television and watch programs about what's happening to our seas, it can be a pretty depressing story. But actually, the science shows that the state of many of the UK's fish stocks have shown encouraging improvement over the last 15 years. So things are actually getting better. There's still plenty of problems, but things are actually getting better. Sadly, the East Anglia seems to have drawn the short straw at the moment. If we just take the value of the landings, the total value of the reported landings of commercial species in the southern North Sea, in other words, the area of sea which is most directly located off our coast, has varied between 190 million to 260 million pounds a year in recent years. Of that, between 7 and 12%, it varies from year to year, is landed by the UK fleet. And of that, the East Anglian ports receive 63% of the UK vessel landings. In other words, about 4% of the total resources available in the southern North Sea. Most of the fin fish that are caught are landed overseas into ports in the Netherlands and France. Now, that would be bad enough, but a number of the key stocks are actually causing the regional industry serious concern. There's been a complete absence of cod for several years. Overfishing will have contributed to that, but actually there are other factors probably of more significance, such as climate change. The fish are moving north. Catches of sole and plaice have been falling dramatically, despite the scientists recommended increases in catch limits. There's a mismatch between what the experts are saying is okay, and what actually the fishers on the ground are saying, no, there's a real problem here. And then a few years back, the bass stocks, very important species commercially, nosedived. And actually it was the UK that persuaded our EU colleagues that emergency measures were needed. And thankfully, those are now beginning to take effect. Most of the shellfish stocks are carefully monitored, but there are worries about whelks. I don't know whether any of you have ever eaten a whelk, but I wouldn't recommend it. But others seem to enjoy it elsewhere in the world. It's mostly an export market. It's become increasingly commercially important as other opportunities have declined. And there is concern that this species might be being overexploited as a consequence of that. And there isn't the data there to effectively manage it. In short, the fishers off of East Anglia are finding it harder and harder to make a living. And this has a knock-on effect down the supply chain. For every job at sea, there's a multiplier effect. So you would expect 2, 3, possibly 4 jobs on land for every job at sea. And if those jobs are being lost at sea, then the jobs at land are lost. The industry is both in East Anglia, both seaward and land-based, is highly diverse. There are specialised shellfish fleets operating to the north and south, and in between there's inshore finfish and flatfish fleet, which targets a diverse set of species. Offshore, there are mostly large foreign-owned, though some are British registered, boats which land most of their fish into foreign ports. And then along the coast, we have chartered recreation angling boats and individual angling vessels and recreational shore fishing, which are actually important to the local economy. There are 2 main types of aquaculture, the cultivation of oysters and mussels. The processing sector in East Anglia has decreased in size over the last decade, and it no longer relies on landings from the region. The number of processing plants in East Anglia has decreased by over 30% in the last 8 years, and employment in processing has halved over the same period. And this simply reflects the declining landings in the region. Those businesses, processors that remain, buy in fish, their raw stock, from further afield, from Grimsby, Peterhead and Brixham, for example. And the operating margins for the wild capture fishers and the processors are very tight. Incomes can be very low. There are more than 130 boats landing less than £10,000 of fish a year. Not through choice. I mean, some of them will be part-time fishers, but many of those people would like to be able to go fishing on a full-time basis. They just can't make the money. So the industry is hanging on by its fingertips. To make matters worse, the pandemic has hit the industry hard, with many of the fishers falling between the cracks when it comes to government support. And unfortunately, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the EU-UK agreement, has not helped the fishing industry in East Anglia. Now, over time, that may change. You know, things may improve, but unfortunately, time is not on the side of the industry.
Rodney, would you be able to just quick, we're running out of time, if you can just,
yep.
Obviously this is the important bit, which is very helpful.
Okay. Levelling up and what's needed. A lot can be done to turn this around. There are 3 principal problems that have been identified by the fishers: the lack of fishing opportunities and their access to fish. That could be changed by changing the way in which the fishing opportunities are distributed and changing the management system. Improvements to the port and road infrastructure, because those fish have to be transported. There's a lack of facilities to repair boats, to lift out boats for maintenance. And there's limited access to specialist engineers, equipment suppliers and such like. I would add a 4th actually, which is risk to safety. A lot of these vessels now are operating with single crew. They're doing that for economic reasons, and it's very dangerous. It's not to be recommended. And the answer isn't to regulate it out, but actually to give people sufficient income to be able to crew their boats properly. What needs to be done is that there needs to be a clear plan. I know this might sound remarkably obvious, but there isn't one. Reef has assembled a series of recommendations that we would like to see delivered, which would transform actually the local fisheries. But fisheries is centrally controlled. It's a very top-down management system. And so that requires a plan at the central level. It requires a strategy. Vital also is the sustainable management of fisheries. A report to DEFRA about 3 or 4 years ago, or a report by commissioned by DEFRA, indicated that nationally we could increase the value of landings of fish by about 500 million, simply by better managing the way that we look after the fish stocks. That would be thousands of new jobs. I've mentioned the redistribution of fishing opportunities. There's a trade-off. There's a choice. We can either, and that in the sense the government can either choose to allow the current process of consolidation to continue. So you have a few very large vessels catching fish highly efficiently, but providing few jobs and landing most of their fish abroad. Or you can have smaller vessels not tiny, but smaller vessels, operating with a crew of 4 or 5 and landing into British ports. But to land into British ports, there have to be the facilities for the fishing industry. There has to be the storage. There has to be the capacity to service those vessels. There has to be the freezers. There has to be the transport. So infrastructure is very important. And finally, the supply chain can be short. We need to look at the way in which the public sector can play its part, bearing in mind that nearly 20% of food service outlets are actually belong to the public sector. Thank you.
Rodney, very many thanks for that. And there is an opportunity next week of a debate to highlight these opportunities, which I shall be doing and probably liaising with you beforehand. That brings us on to our final speaker, who is Pete Waters. He is the Executive Director of Visit East of England. Pete, welcome. I will now have to depart now to ask my question on early years education, and I'll leave you in the good hands of Daniel. Pete, welcome.
You need to unmute.
Apologies. Thank you, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm conscious of time, so I'll go through this as quickly as I can. In terms of the visitor economy, the main levelling up issues and importantly solutions for coastal and waterfront towns in the east of England are fourfold: developing long-term career jobs in the visitor economy, developing the year-round visitor economy to sustain full-time employment, investment for regeneration and connectivity, and more generally, levelling up for the east of England means attracting more inbound visitors. In 2019, the visitor economy of Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk and Cambridgeshire combined, evaluated by the Cambridge model, was over £11 billion. Visit Britain forecast the value of tourism in 2020 would have been just 37% of the 2019 figures. If replicated in the East, the value of tourism would have declined by £7 billion. The Visit Britain forecast for 2021 is 56% of 2019 figures. That means between 2020 and 2021, the region would have lost the entirety of 2019's tourism value, £11 billion. According to the 2018 East of England forecasting model with UK CES working futures, our visitor economy was expected to grow 12% between 2014 and 2024, double the growth across the overall economy in the region. The worldwide pandemic has clearly impacted on that, and it will take time to recover. Nonetheless, it has highlighted the importance of travel and tourism to the overall economy, and especially to employment. In 2019, over 246,000 people in the region were dependent on a thriving travel and tourism sector for their livelihoods. Around a third of travel and tourism jobs are held by young people, aged 16 to 24, compared to just 12% of all jobs in the wider economy. That's most starkly seen in coastal resorts. In Great Yarmouth, for instance, 40% of all employment is in tourism. COVID has had a hugely detrimental impact on that and will be felt disproportionately by young people. Last autumn, tourism business research by Visit Great Yarmouth and the town's tourism business improvement district suggested that 50% of businesses did not think they would make it to Easter 2021. Undoubtedly, government financial support, not least furloughing and the VAT reduction, saved many businesses. However, as of July 1st this year, 20% of businesses still felt themselves at risk of closure. Visit Great Yarmouth and the TBID's most recent research from July 1st has found that 86% of all members who responded still wanted grants to be available. 77% of businesses want some option of ongoing government support if required. 69% of businesses want long-term relief on business rates, PAYE and VAT. This picture will be replicated in traditional waterfront and seaside towns, including Kings Lynn, Cromer, Hunstanton, Lowestoft, Felixstowe, Clacton and Southend. We must remember that while tourism reopened slowly from March, businesses have been operating under capacity, detrimentally impacting cash flow. Many accommodation bookings are held over from last year, so it's not new revenue. Also, we expect a flurry of cancellations when overseas travel begins again. In Visit East of England's recent research, although 76% of respondents said they wanted to come to the region on holiday this year, 56% said they would go abroad as soon as they could. And as has already been mentioned, we have massive staff shortages, particularly in hospitality. We must not be lulled into thinking the visitor economy is out of the woods, far from it. However, tourism can build back better, faster. It can grow employment and value quickly. According to our latest tourism business survey, more than 60% of SMEs suggest the biggest barrier to productivity is the absence of a year-round visitor economy. If we develop that, we can unburden ourselves of zero-hour contracts. A year-round industry will encourage businesses to invest in full-time employment, in higher wages, and on-the-job skills. Not least, it will prevent youngsters becoming economic migrants, as Sasha mentioned earlier, forced to move to larger urban centres for worthwhile work. By developing the sector year-round, we can also level up tourism both geographically and seasonally, not by displacing visitors, but growing their number and value. And this is linked to the necessity of changing the narrative that tourism is seasonal, low-skilled, and low-paid. We want to create year-round, well-paid, skilled careers, not holiday jobs, particularly to support young people into tourism careers and to grow sector productivity. In boosting productivity, we need to support entrepreneurship, encourage innovation, and enhance digital skills. This will require much stronger collaboration to build and promote a higher quality product if we are to attract higher value visitors all year round. Through our East of England Destination Management Plan that we're currently working on with all local authorities and tourism bodies, we are working to establish an ambitious skills agenda following the lead of the DCMS Tourism Recovery Plan, but this needs financial stimulus from funds including community renewal and levelling up. We also need to invest in regeneration and product development, particularly with a view to net zero and clean growth. Utilising and investing in cultural and heritage assets is key to developing the year-round visitor economy, as is building back better our high streets and nighttime economy. Fibre optic connections are slowly being established, but there is still a dearth of good quality broadband. Creating career jobs within our built and natural capital goes hand in hand with developing people with the right skills. The East of England's Destination Management Plan takes into consideration that our towns and coastal areas have different needs and is designed to complement local strategies. It would be a mistake to think there is a simple panacea to levelling up. Broad brushstrokes must have local subtleties and flourishes. The final levelling up point is unrelated, but extremely important for growing tourism value and employment year round, and that's attracting more overseas visitors to the East of England. Currently, more than 97% of day and staying visits to the region by a domestic audience. Working with our gateways and transport operators, we can level up with other regions by attracting more inbound visitors. Those gateways include London Stansted, the fastest growing airport in the UK prior to COVID, Norwich International Airport with daily flights from Schiphol, making it one of the best connected airports in the country, and the Port of Harwich with daily ferries from the continent. Great Yarmouth also has an ambition to bring more cruise ships to its deep water inner harbour. Cambridge, the most popular day trip destination for North Americans staying in London, is our most internationally recognised brand and can be used to attract more international visitors to the region, in turn helping Stansted broaden its route network and level up the disproportionate number of overseas tourists entering via Heathrow. Pre-COVID, 57% of all international visitors arrived through Heathrow. They stayed in London and gravitated west to the Cotswolds, Bath and Shakespeare's country. They didn't come to the East of England. Increasing visitor traffic can be used to strengthen and broaden Stansted's route network. Currently, the airport's connectivity with, for instance, North America is poor. However, air travel demand creates a virtuous circle. A route drives more traffic, which encourages airlines to lay on more services. And following Greater Anglia's £1.5 billion investment in new environmentally friendly rolling stock and services, the biggest investments in Victorian times, rail could and should be the principal transport for visitors from London and the wider capital area. Revenue from commuter season tickets will not return to pre-COVID levels. Then Greater Anglia operated trains throughout the day from London to the region, but were nowhere near capacity. Daytime rail transport should be reduced in price to fill that capacity and bring more visitors to the region. Ideas like the domestic rail leisure ticket outlined in the DCMS Tourism Recovery Plan are good. Despite the investment in rolling stock, there also needs to be investment in upgrades to the infrastructure, improved signalling, the Bow Junction remodelling, Ely, as has been mentioned, and line speed improvements could generate up to £9.3 billion in economic benefits, kickstart tens of thousands of jobs along the route, and create more than 4,000 construction jobs while the improvements are made. The East-West Rail Link project between Oxford and Cambridge must also be extended to Norwich. More frequent and faster rail services from the west will enable greener travel and bring more visitors. Without doubt, levelling up on inbound tourism from the East of England will benefit global Britain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. There's an awful lot in there. I'm very conscious we're already running slightly over time. We probably tried to squeeze too much in to a short session today, but all this evidence is important. and will be fed into our sessions. I too am going to have to follow Peter's chamber in a second, so I'm going to have Steve Barwick take you just through the last few points of the session. Thank you all so much for your contributions this morning. Really important and valuable. Steve.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, well, just very quickly, we've got a Q&A session, so I know other people will have to leave as well at 11:30. So if there are some questions for Paul, Rodney or Pete, well, basically Rodney and Pete, just could you indicate now? Otherwise, we'll just do the usual thanks. Got any burning questions?